The recent shooting at a high school in Florida has parents and students across the country on edge, including here in New Mexico. And now, as we sat down to tape this week, a suspect had been arrested in Belen after making threats against Belen High School on social media. Los Lunas, Rio Rancho, and Albuquerque public schools have investigated potential threats over social media about schools in this past week alone. Many parents have kept their kids home because of the threats. Now, this has made us here wonder, at New Mexico in Focus, what is being done to address potential threats at schools in our area? Dan, I mentioned Rio Rancho. That blew up all over Facebook a couple nights ago, and a lot of parents were very concerned. But there's some things that have come out of the listening session that was in the White House, the CNN town hall meeting on Wednesday night. A lot of ideas are out there about beefing up school security. In your mind, what can be done right now to make parents feel better about kids being in school and feeling safe?
Well, so that's kind of a loaded question. And the reason I say that is you say what can be done right now.
Sure.
Clearly a show of force.
Okay.
I mean, clearly if you pull up to the school and there's multiple police cars and officers walking around campus, that's an immediate show of force that I think makes people say, we feel safer.
Right.
You know, I think that's a sort of short-term solution because I don't think it's sustainable to put 50 police officers at every school in every city in every state in the country.
Right.
But I think, I think that's the route we're going to have to go. I mean, I think there's no greater example than the anonymity that social media gives people. You know, we were talking just the other day. I mean, the worst thing you could do when I was in high school was pull the fire alarm. You pulled the fire alarm.
Right.
And I mean, it was a no-no.
2-day suspension.
Yep.
Right.
I mean, I mean, the ability now to post something to threaten somebody without your name, without anybody knowing who you are, causing all kinds of work to try to figure out who it was, and then you have no choice but to respond.
Right.
It's heart-wrenching. It's gut-wrenching.
Right.
I think the president has done a decent job of getting these sides together, bringing people in. I think that he's coming up with some solutions. He thinks that it's going to try to address some of this stuff, which I'm kind of impressed is, one, he's thinking outside the box. Two, he's going against some of the very fiber of the people who supported him with the NRA and the folks like that. I think the bump stock stuff that he's come out with has clearly shown that I think he's separating himself from being that Twitter angry guy, and I think some people are starting to look at him and go, is he leading on this issue? I think the Senator Rubio town hall on CNN was very enlightening. I think it's clearly an emotional issue. It's always been an emotional issue,
right?
But it's always been an emotional issue because we talk about it, and since I've been thinking about these things, for 20 plus years, you might have known someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone. Over the last 25 years, that 6 degrees of separation has turned into 1 or 2.
That's right. Laura, interestingly, in the president's listening session, he proposed the idea that's become the talk of the week of arming teachers. And his idea is 20% of teachers across the country should be able to carry firearms with training, that this would be a deterrent. A lot of activity out there on Facebook and other places about this idea. What's your sense of that? Is that a workable solution in your mind when you think about it?
Our firm works a lot with school districts around the state, and this is an issue that's come up in the past. It's not new, and I think it's regional. I think there's some parts of the state where people are much more comfortable with guns, and they have considered this. They've talked about it. It's been something that certain pockets of the state want to see it, mostly in southern New Mexico. And then there's some areas that think it's an absolutely terrible idea, and for very valid reasons. I think a lot of them believe that that it's not a realistic option. For one, teachers are very busy to begin with.
Right.
To expect them to have the presence of mind at that moment to reach for a gun and be able to use it competently is not something that people are comfortable with. So I think that there's a lot of problems with that as a solution. I think what Dan said about him, the president, taking this on right now, I think he has an opportunity to really lead on this issue. I'm not sure that that's what he's going to do. I mean, he at least had I commend him at least for having a meeting, excuse me, and having cameras in that meeting. I think that's an important conversation for the American public to be able to witness. But I think it also depends what he's going to do moving forward. I think the bump stock issue is definitely a first step, and it sounds like the NRA is actually supportive of that. I read somewhere where that was the case, but we'll see how much
They are
more.
not in agreement about upping the age from 18 to 21 to be able to
Right.
buy arms like this young man in Parkland,
Right. There's
Florida
still a
did.
lot of areas where they're drawing a line.
That's
and
right.
It depends. We'll see if he actually pushes back on that.
That's right. Dee Dee, young people are making their voices heard on this.
Yeah.
We've seen this week alone, again, a very busy week. We've had marches here in Albuquerque. Valley High School walked out. Some students walked out.
La Cueva.
La Cueva, some Farmington kids are showing their support. In Washington, D.C., there was visits at the Capitol, Tallahassee, just on it goes. Are you sensing that this push from young people that are saying, look, we are the generation that's had to put up with this. Adults can't get this done, but we're going to get this done one way or the other. Is this really the story coming out of this week?
Well, I think so because, yes, I think this will be a lasting impact here. And I think that, really the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement was led initially by high school students. And who were just fed up, and felt themselves to be pawns in the game. And I think that's what a lot of people are feeling now, that they're pawns in the game between the NRA and elected officials, and their inability to solve this problem. And meanwhile, shooting after shooting occurs, while those common sense solutions are out there, of background checks, of not allowing teenagers who can't buy a beer to buy a automatic weapon, and and domestic violence perpetrators are allowed to buy automatic weapons, and meanwhile the shootings keep happening on a regular basis, and you see the superintendents of schools on the air and the parents on the air, and they are powerless.
Right.
They are powerless to do anything. My heart broke to see the Aztec superintendent come on the TV and say, "We are stronger after this. Aztec strong, and here's the mug. Aztec strong." Well, there were people killed that didn't need to be killed. And, it's a complex problem. Sure, everybody agrees that we need to do more in terms of mental health. But
Is arming teachers to you a viable solution?
Well, I think arming teachers, it should be talked about, but I think there's so many downsides in terms of training teachers, the liability issues here, the many problems that schools would have in implementing something like that.
Right.
And I'd be very leery of it, and I think teachers themselves will be very leery of that, and the problems accidents that it might create.
That's a good point. Tom, pick up on that. There's a lot of activity out there, people having a strong opinion about this, but as Laura mentioned and others mentioned, is it worthy to think about? I mean, the NRA Director Wayne LaPierre had a big speech at CPAC on Thursday morning talking about this just needs to be more, we do better at protecting stores that sell diamonds than we do children. And it's a fair point, but what more can be done?
Yeah, I think Mr. LaPierre brought up, what I thought was interesting about his comments to CPAC was it's politics versus safety,
right?
And really discerning where the two lie. And I believe that arming the teachers might sound good, but in practicality, not really. There are other things that could be done. Things like concealed carry reciprocity. 60 Minutes had a fantastic overview as far as the issues there, increasing the age to 21 as far as to buy a weapon, and then also just strengthen the background checks and maybe focus more on mental health as a part of that. Three of those things are. Depending on which side of the issue you're on, might seem like you just can't do it. But I think we need to start somewhere. Arming teachers, I think, is a therapeutic response, and I think that was just something that was a reaction by the president, during his town hall. I don't believe that he's really, or I would hope not anyway, that they're really considering that because teachers have enough on their plate.
They are considering it. I mean, not only are they considering it, there's schools in New Mexico that are trying to do it. There's schools across the country that are trying to do it. I agree with Laura. I mean, obviously, you're not going to have schools in Santa Fe saying let's arm teachers, but you have schools that are out rural New Mexico that if they dial 911, it may take 30 minutes for someone to get there. I mean, you know, this whole arming the teachers thing is, I mean, it's definitely a tough conversation. I mean, I've talked to many friends of mine that are teachers that are pro Second Amendment, pro guns, they hunt, they shoot. And I mean, they've just said to me, they're like, you know, I see why we would do it, but I don't know if I could ever go back to school if I had to shoot somebody. You know, but I think the conversation has got to be, you know, I think at some point we have to have a fair conversation about guns in this country and what we can do. For instance, you know, everybody says the NRA this and the NRA that and the Second Amendment. Well, you know, listen, if you want to change the Constitution, go through the process of changing the Constitution. I think where I have some consternation is when we want to bypass the process of changing the Constitution and say, well, we just want a court to do it. Or when we have conversations and we're actually intellectually dishonest. I mean, to say that people with domestic violence are buying guns left and right, well, you have the Lautenberg Amendment that says if you're convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence, you can't buy a handgun.
Right.
So in this example in Florida, you know, we're quick to rush to the front and say it's the gun's fault. The NRA side and the Second Amendment folks that are out there rush to say, well, guns don't kill people kill people.
Right.
But at the end of the day, you know, no one's having a serious conversation about all the rules that are in place, all the safeguards.
And the loopholes that are
right, but all the rules that are in place, but Gene, the rules and the safeguards that are in place that were completely missed to prevent this from happening.
Right.
I mean, the calls that went in to the police, to the FBI, to all these people that said, we got a problem over here, and everybody just said no. So there's multiple laws that potentially could have prevented this, but the people we entrust with enforcing those laws, investigating those laws, kind of punted on it. And so, you know, I think that we can't have a conversation about this if we don't have a serious conversation about mental health in this country.
That's right.
I think they go hand in hand because I
And the
have yet to
services that
see
come with
one.
that.
That's right.
That's
Because
right.
I have yet to see one of these instances of shootings that anybody would say the person who committed this crime, boy, they were just a great, solid, mentally safe, mentally stable individual. And we're talking more about the gun than we are.
Well,
the
there's some
services.
debate about that, so we have to wrap up. There's some debate of what constitutes a mental illness versus rage and anger.
Or immaturity.
Or immaturity. There's a lot of different things there that, you know, the science shows that mentally ill people do not perpetrate these kind of crimes. It's about other reasons. Now, we'll have to end it there. We'll come back to this at some point. When we come back to the line tonight, we'll discuss ranked choice voting in Santa Fe.